Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and I wanted to talk stitch markers today. So let's talk about that. So mostly what we're talking about is different kinds of stitch markers that you professionally buy, or most likely have not had to buy but have been given to you in some way, shape, or form, and what the different kinds are really good at being used for. So we're not talking about like using rubber bands or spare yarn or paper clips or paper clamps. I've used those. It's very awkward. Or anything that's just laying around the house. Yes, those are valid options, especially if you don't want to go buy some, professionally made stitch markers. But chances are you have some stitch markers you got somewhere, somehow, that are just lying around. I'm going to show you some from my collection. I have purchased very few of these. I've gotten several sets from my Knit Crate subscription. I have gotten some as part of beginner knitter or crochet kits that I got when I was beginning to knit and crochet. I have purchased some. I have made some. And it's one of those things that the next thing you know, you just have this huge collection. So I'm going to talk about some of the different styles and what they're good for, because knitting stitch markers and crochet stitch markers are actually a different thing. Though you can use the crochet stitch markers for knitting, it just doesn't work the other way around. So let's get into my kit. So crochet stitch markers typically either are called locking stitch markers, or they have some way that they can be an open stitch marker but still stay in the fabric. So a locking stitch marker looks like a safety pin, and in fact you can use an actual safety pin. They close and they lock, so if you need to put them in your fabric, they can just stay. You typically use crochet stitch markers in crochet to either mark the beginning of a round when you're making circles on a continuous loop without closing the circle first and then starting a new round. You can also use these as progress keepers, which is also something you can do in knitting, by the way. So you basically put it into your fabric, like that, close it up, and you can see how much progress you've made from that point onward. This is very good if you've got a set number of repeats that you have to do, or if you need to reach a certain length, you have a point from which you can measure. And there's several different types of this. The most common is this cheap piece of crap locking stitch marker. I got these free with my crochet hook set. I don't particularly like these. You can also have some that are like this, where you actually put it through the fabric right here, because that's how it kind of opens, and you put it around. So like this, and it's not likely to come out because it's pretty solidly on there. But yet when you want it off, you just take it off. Or my personal favorite, which are these. They're Clover brand, and they're open, and they work just the same as the other one, but they're much neater. These come off a little bit easier as well, because as you're working, if it just kind of works itself over this way, it'll come off like super easy. But as long as you just kind of keep it near this little knot thing that looks like it's right here, you'll be fine. And that's pretty much all the crochet ones. Knitting ones, you've got actual knitting stitch markers that you put on the needle, and then you have progress keepers that you put in the work. So pretty much all of these that I already showed you will work as progress keepers because you put them in the work and they're removable. Another option is a safety pin. Yay, that's where I put that. Anyway, you can have a stitch marker with a lobster claw. So you get a bigger lobster claw like this, you can put it into projects with thicker yarn. Like this will work pretty comfortably around a size 5, maybe even a size 6 if you're doing one single strand. You can also do, this is one I made with poured resin. So this is a lever back earring that I used, as you can see. Let's see if you can. So, you know, this lever back can work on really big yarn. It's also very thin, so it can work on very thin yarn as well. You know, just ta-da! And it's removable. This is made from resin, so it's actually very light, even though it's a little bit bigger. It's meant to be an earring. I mean, this whole entire thing can be used as an earring, except I've only got one. So that's an option. You can also have progress keepers that have very small little lobster claws. These are better for smaller gauge items because, you know, see, this is so much smaller compared to this one. See that size difference? You know, you're definitely going to use this on smaller yarns than this. But you stick them in the yarn, they dangle. It's considered jewelry for your knitting. And that's pretty cool. You know, so that works pretty well in the yarn. But you can also have some that are actually on the needles. So, for example, this is my beginning of round marker. You can see how it's actually on the needle right in between two stitches, and it's going to stay there. So that's really helpful if you're knitting in the round and you need to know where your round starts every single time. I mean, you can probably figure it out, especially if you're like me and you don't weave your tail in at the end, but sometimes you need to know specifically where your knitting starts, especially if you need to indicate the beginning and the end of a specific stitch pattern. So like I have this other one on the other side of my knitting because I am knitting a 2x2 rib to this spot, and then I'm knitting stockinette for the rest of the round. And I do that because if I'm not fully paying attention, 9 times out of 10, I'm not just knitting. I'm knitting and watching a movie, or I'm knitting and I'm watching YouTube, or listening to an audiobook, or whatever else I want to do, or I'm picking it up and putting it down, and I have to be able to look at my work and figure out where I'm at. So if I've got different stitch markers indicating different things, then I don't have to think about it so much. So beginning of round is a really good one if you're working in the round. Also, the beginning and end of a particular stitch pattern, or the beginning and end of a particular repeat. Now this is really handy if you're working on like cabling, where you have several different stitch patterns next to each other. Like a lot of sweaters will have a big cable down the middle, 2 different smaller cables down the sides, and then some kind of a spacing stitch pattern in between each cable. So it's very handy that you know the beginning and end of each pattern, so that way you can read your pattern and do it. Also, taking little segments of lace in particular. Like lace for some reason never seems to come out the right way the first time I try it. Swatching is helpful with that, but also each repeat having its own stitch marker at the beginning and end helps with counting up. So say your stitch pattern repeat is 10 stitches and you have to do it 5 times. You're going to have 6 stitch markers. Try saying that 5 times fast. You're going to have 6 stitch markers because you've got the beginning and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that way, each time you finish one repeat, you can count your stitches. If you're in the right spot, like you do that last stitch on that last stitch, you know you've got that section right. If you've got an extra stitch or you have to do one more stitch when you come to the end of those stitches, you know you messed up somewhere. And you know you only have to recount and figure out that one section to fix it. And usually you can figure out what you did wrong and apply that error correction to the next one. So it helps keep you on track. You can also do it for color work. Like if you've got a color repeat, same thing. Or like I made a scarf for my husband. And it was, you see how complex this is, but it's 50 stitches. Well, technically 100 because it's 50 in front and 50 behind, doing double knitting. And most of the work is in the middle. It's not so much on the edges. And there are sections where there's barely anything on the edges except for in the middle. So it really helped to have 10 stitches, sections of 10 stitches blocked off, especially since in the pattern there was a darker line outlining blocks of 10 stitches, both horizontally and vertically. So it helped me keep track, especially since technically it was 20 stitches because you do a front stitch and then a back stitch and then a front stitch and a back stitch. And when you have to swap the colors, then you're still doing a front stitch in the opposite color and a back stitch in the opposite color. It makes figuring out mistakes a lot easier that way too, especially since you are going backwards and forwards. I'm going to have a whole video on how to do this coming out sometime in the future, so keep an eye out for that. But just know that keeping track of the stitch markers or of the stitches with stitch markers made it so that I didn't have to count 50 front and back stitches across my entire piece to make sure I'm in the right spot. I didn't have to count 13 stitches to where I have to do my first color change. I could just do, 10 stitches, this section is all background color. The next section, well, I have to do about 4 background color and then I get into the pattern, so I could do the 4, check the pattern, and it kept me on track so much more easily. And eventually you just start learning how to read the pattern so you can start seeing small sections of it and knowing, oh, that's 4 stitches or that's 3 stitches or 2 stitches, just at a glance. So it made it so much easier. And there's a lot of different types of stitch markers that can go on the needles for stitching. The big thing is that they are closed. So, this actually will work because unless you're dealing with a very small needle, it's not likely to just slip off. This one, if you're able to close it, it'll stay. It just might be a bit big. So a lot of knitting stitch markers tend to be a little bit smaller around. For example, I really like these ones. They are just some wire, and they glue on a bead where they want to close the wire, so that way everything is securely closed. I have these in various colors. It's a red, white, and blue set because when I bought it was around 4th of July. But it doesn't have to be like that. You can also have little loops with a bead. I got these as part of a kit. It was actually for a, it was part of a knit crate, I believe. or something akin to that. I really like these. These came in Cocoa Knits, and they actually have, or they're Cocoa Knits brand. I've actually no, I haven't repurchased these, but they're little triangles. But they're very small, so they're really good for like sock knitting, or I use these on my husband's scarf because I use 2mm needles, and the larger size was perfect for that. Good luck seeing that. There's smaller ones that are specifically for knitting socks and can be used on a US 1 or smaller. That came in the same package. There's also fancy stitch markers. They typically have a jump ring, and they can have kind of whatever on the end. So, like that. This came with a couple of little mushrooms. I purchased some. They can have little burnt wood things. This one says Selfish Knitter. You can also, there's this, it's paper, and you can draw or print stuff on it and cut it out and then put it in the oven on 300 degrees for just a few minutes, and it shrinks. It's like shrink paper or something. Anyway, I got one of those at the beginning of the pandemic. That was toilet paper roll. I'm not sure if you can really see that, but I thought that was hilarious. One for Heroes. I'm not sure exactly what this is. It looks like it's got some kind of a sketch, and it's not showing up very well because it's shiny. One that says thank you. You can have pretty much anything dangling at the end of these. These are good for smaller diameter knitting needles. And that is a trick. You want to have it the right diameter, a little bit bigger than the diameter of your knitting needle, so that way you can slip it from one to the other very easily. You don't want it too big. You don't want it too small. And if you get a set of needles, that's kind of the best perk, is you also get some really good stitch markers. I am a ChiaoGoo girl through and through. And I honestly love their stitch markers. They're round, fully round. They're made out of plastic. And every single set of theirs comes with appropriately sized little stitch markers. And they've got different gauges and different colors for each gauge. So like this is kind of the moderate size that's really good for about US 3 through US 8. They have bigger ones that are in green, and even larger ones that are in blue. And they have smaller ones that are really good for US 4 and below, that are pink. That are, I use them sometimes for socks and stuff. So those kinds of things are handy. So a lot of times if you're buying a set, you're going to get stitch markers along with it. You can also purchase stitch markers from individual sellers on Etsy who hand make them. You can also go to Joann Fabrics, Hobby Lobby, Michaels, and wherever they have the needles, there's usually stitch markers somewhere near there. So if you need to pick some up, they're usually less than $5 a pop. There's the Cocoa Knits one that are triangles that I really like because they stick out without sticking out. And ultimately, when it comes to stitch markers, you'll get one, the kind that you can afford, and two, the kind that works best with your style of knitting or crochet. So just know that it isn't a uniform thing. You don't even have to use them at all if you don't need to. They're just a tool that's very handy and cheap, and usually you get them for free. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, post them in the comments and I'll get back to you on that whenever I see them. And have a great day. Happy crafting. Bye.